Chapter 18. The man named Twilly showed no reaction when he saw Nick and Marta in the back seat of the Prius. He sat down behind the wheel, placed 2 pizza boxes on the seat beside him, and started the car. "Can you take us to see Mrs. Starch?" Nick said. Twilly didn't respond. In the rearview mirror, he could see he was counting to himself. "What are you doing?" Marta asked him. "You've got until I count to 20 to clear this car." Nick said, "We're not moving until we get some answers." "And if you try to throw us out," Marta said, "I'm going to scream until somebody calls the cops." Twilly sighed and said, "Such drama." He turned in his seat and started back in the Prius out of the parking space. Marta pointed at him. "What is that?" "Vulture beaks. A friend gave them to me," Twilly said, "for good luck." Sun-beached and crusty, the 2 beaks were tied to a frayed leather lanyard and dangled against his bare chest. Marta made a face at Nick and mouthed the word, "Yuck." Twilly eased the car into traffic. Trying to mask his nervousness with conversation, Nick said, "I'm reading one of the Edward and Abby books. It's sick." In the mirror, Twilly eyed him. "I assume that means you like it?" "Yeah, he's funny." "Was there really a monkey wrench gang?" "God, I wish." Twilly laughed to himself and pulled his ski cap down to his brow. "How about you?" he said to Marta. "What do you read?" She said, "All the Harry Potters 3 times. Seriously. Did those gross things come off a vulture?" "Yup." "So your friend?" "No. He didn't shoot them," Twilly said. "They were roadkills." Marta nodded, fascinated. "Aren't those the beaks like magic or something?" "That I wouldn't know." As they passed the ramp to the interstate highway, heading further and further away from town, Nick wondered if he'd made a big mistake. They knew practically nothing about this man. He could be driving them to Bella Glade to dump them in Lake Okeechobee. Nick said, "Mrs. Starch isn't really your aunt, is she?" "Of course not," Twilly replied. "So is she like your prisoner?" Marta said bluntly. "We know you were out in the swamp during the school field trip because you're in the video that Nick took wearing the same ammo belt that you've got on now. Are you the one who set the fire?" Nick sunk down in his seat. Once Marta got comfortable, she was capable of saying anything. To Nick, it seemed like a bad time to accuse Twilly of being a kidnapper and an arsonist. Yet he didn't get mad. "So many little pesky questions," he said with a note of amusement. "First of all, I'm not holding dear Aunt Bunny prisoner. Anybody who tried to do that would live to regret it, I'm sure. And I'm right. And you're right, I was in the Black Vine Swamp that day, but I didn't light the fire. Somebody else did." "It wasn't Smoke, was it?" Nick heard himself. "Smoke?" "His real name was Dwayne Screw Jr., Nick said. "Marta saw him riding in the car the other day with you." Twilly said, "I've been known to pick up hitchhikers." Nick went on, "Dwayne's in Mrs. Starch's biology class with us. Yesterday, a detective came to arrest him for the arson, but he got away." Marta was impatient. "He told Nick he's innocent, but the fire department found his book bag at the scene." In the mirror, Twilly's expression had grown serious. "The fire department didn't find it. A civilian found it and called the arson squad." "What's the difference?" Marta said. "Huge difference, princess." "How do you know all this?" Nick said excitedly. "Have you seen Smoke?" Twilly said, "That's enough chit-chat." He handed him one of the pizza boxes to Marta. "One more question, please," Nick implored, "and then we'll shut up, won't we, Marta?" She gave Nick a sarcastic, polite smile before attacking the pizza. Twilly drummed his hands on the steering wheel. "Who really started the fire?" Nick said. "If I knew that, I'd..." "You'd what?" "Nothing," Twilly said, and he turned up the radio. By the time Jimmy Lee Bayless arrived at the emergency room, Drake McBride was no longer bellowing at the nurses. This is because they had given him an injection of special medicine to make him settle down and behave. They told Jimmy Lee Bayless that Drake McBride probably had a concussion from landing on his head and possibly broken ribs. "King Thunderbolt threw me off," Drake McBride complained woozily. "Then he did a danged-up tap dance on my chest." Jimmy Lee Bayless sat down and said, "You're going to be fine." "They won't even let me see a doctor." "You've got to wait, same as everyone else does." "But why? I'm not like everyone else," Drake McBride whined. "I tried to give them some cash to let me go first, but they got all snotty and mad." Jimmy Lee Bayless was glad he missed that scene. "You can't bribe a nurse. Hospitals don't work that way." "It wasn't a bribe, it was a tip." Drake McBride paused to vomit in a plastic bedpan. "Look up," he said. "Do me a favor, partner. Go out to the barn and shoot that no-good nag for me, would you? Before he cripples somebody else, namely yours truly." Yes, sir, said Jimmy the Bailiff, who had no intention of harming Drake's horse. On most Saturdays, the hospital emergency room bustled. Among those in the waiting room were Drake McBride, where a middle-aged woman who had crashed her moped into a mailbox, an old gentleman who had been beamed by his partner during a tennis match, and a surely young burglar handcuffed to a chair, who had been bitten by a police dog. That shot made me dizzy, said Drake McBride, and my head's still killing me. Even though his boss was groggy and in pain, Jimmy Lee Bailiff decided to go ahead and tell him. Sir, I've got some good news and some bad news, he said. Drake McBride groaned. Let me explain something. If you've got bad news, then there ain't no good news. The bad always cancels out the good. Jimmy the Bailiff lowered his voice. They're going to charge that pyro kid for doing the fire in Section 22, he said to Drake McBride. That means we're in the clear. Okay, what else? Don't hold back, because I'm just sitting here with like 9 fractured ribs and a major brain injury. Jimmy the Bailiff told him first about Melton. That bozo got ambushed again. This time they spray painted him blaze orange from head to toe and tied him to the hood of his trunk. Butt naked. Same as before, Drake McBride asked. Yes, sir. Was it in a Red Diamond Company truck? Luckily, it was me who found him and not some outsider, Jimmy the Bailiff said. Otherwise, it could have made the newspapers or even Fox TV. A naked orange person in the middle of the swamp. Drake McBride noticed something somberly. Yeah, that's a winner. Thanks for ruining my day, which was already pretty much bad by that dumb horse. Jimmy the Bailiff wasn't finished. Whoever did it, they took the front axle off the pickup. The company pickup. Yes, sir. Need to lie down, Drake McBride slid off the chair and sprawled to the floor. The other patients sitting with their relatives ignored him. There's more, Jimmy the Bailiff said. A game warden called me this morning at the car wash. That's where I took Melton to scrub off his paint job. Drake McBride groaned. State or federal game warden. A feds, a wildlife agent. He called himself. Oh, don't tell me. Yeah, I got a report of the wild panther near our lease. He wants to come out and check around as soon as possible. Drake McBride raised up. So what's the problem? You told me about that the cat was gone. You said the gunshots did the trick. Jimmy the Bailiff knew that his boss didn't have the quickest mind, but being dumped on his head had made Drake McBride unusually slow. The wildlife officer wouldn't need to find a live panther on the property in order to cause major problems for Red Diamond Energy. If he even sees a partial paw print or the tiniest, moldiest lump of scat, the government might step in to supervise the oil drilling operation, perhaps even halt it. The Endangered Species Act is a tough one, Jimmy the Bailiff reminded Drake McBride, who cursed under his breath and collapsed one more on the floor. And what if the officer game warden goes off wandering into Section 22, says Drake McBride, and discovers our little private project there? I imagine we'd have some explaining to do, since that land belongs to the great state of Florida and not us. I'll think of something, Jimmy the Bailiff said. It'll be at least 10 days before we can sink the transfer pipe. So we'll be okay as long as we can get the guy focused on Section 21. And in the meantime, tell me your secret plan for cleaning up any doo-doo that the rotten cat left behind. Jimmy the Bailiff had no strategy for locating and removing panther poop, he said. There's 640 acres. All we can do is pray for a good hard rain. During a drought? That's funny, Drake McBride covered his face in his hands and rocked sideways on the floor. I might just die right here, he said miserably. Jimmy the Bailiff wasn't feeling especially happy and carefree himself. Only 2 weeks earlier had he been looking at real estate brochures from Costa Rica, daydreaming about how he's going to spend his millions of dollars that he's going to make from the Red Diamond oil scam. Now he's worrying about staying out of prison. And we should give Melton a nice raise, he suggested. He's really ticked off about what happened, and we sure don't want him blabbing all over town. Did the orange paint come off, Drake McBride asked. Well, most of it. You got to find out who keeps doing this stuff and put it to stop, whatever's necessary. Jimmy the Bailiff said, I aim to. Don't worry. A stern, broad-shouldered nurse walked up and told Jimmy the Bailiff to move his boss back into the chair. He's next to see the doctor, she said, after the lady with the wasping and the man with the barbecue burn. Glory be, murmured Drake McBride and struggled to his knees. Twilly Spree wasn't an outgoing person, and while he was very generally preferred the company of animals to that of human beings, he tried to be cautious in all relationships. Once he had become too fond of a dopey dog that he kidnapped from a knucklehead who had needed to be taught a hard lesson, Several lessons, in fact. When the time came to say goodbye to the dog, Twilly had found himself so sad and empty that it was alarming. Such sentimental feelings, he believed, could only distract him from his missions. The two kids in the backseat of the car weren't too obnoxious and preferably meant well, yet Twilly remained guardedly quiet during the drive back to Blackfine Swamp. His thoughts were on the boy who called himself Smoke, which is now a fugitive in the need of help. It was very disturbing that Dwayne Screw Jr. was being framed, and Twilly suspected the Red Diamond Energy Corporation was behind the plot. Someone working at the company's drilling site had summoned the arson investigator, a brief meeting that Twilly had observed the previous day from his distinct roost in the cypress tree. At this time, he hadn't known about the stolen book bag, but he put the whole story together after speaking with young Dwayne on the run, and later with a talkative secretary at the sheriff office. Twilly reasoned that the Red Diamond's only motive for pinning the bogus felony on the innocent kid was to hide their own involvement in the arson. Twilly didn't know why the Red Diamond would ignite a brush fire to scare kids away on a school field trip. But he was working on different theories. Because it was a new company, little information about the Red Diamond was available on the internet. However, a private investigator hired by Twilly had dug up the name and president of the chief operating officer, Drake W. McBride, which was beginning. Meanwhile, Twilly continued to sneak forays into Section 21, where the same poor dunce and twice confronted him, both times to be dealt with firmly. Twice, our Twilly spree felt a tap on his shoulder. From the back seat, the boy named Nick Waters said, "Could you please turn down the radio?" "Nope," said Twilly. "Then at least change the station," said Marta. Negative. Twilly's driving music was classic rock, nothing else. Nick, covering over his shoulder, said, "Do you work for Mrs. Starch?" "I told you, no more questions. Eat pizza." Marta said, "He doesn't like mushrooms or olives." "Too bad." Twilly opened the windows to blow out the cheesy pizza smell. "For your information, I don't work for anyone. I'm known as what's an unemployable." "Are you like homeless?" asked Marta. "Just the opposite. I can live anywhere." Twilly was half tempted to pull over on the remote stretch of the road and abandon the two kids, but he thought they might be helpful later. And at the very least, it would be good for Dwayne Jr. to know somebody else cared about him. Twilly turned off Route 29 onto a dusty farm road. A few minutes later, the Prius was inching down a bumpy overgrown passage that was once a railroad spur for a logging operation. The path ended at a broken gate, which bore a rusty no trespassing sign. Twilly parked beneath a giant strangler fig, shut off the radio, and instructed his passengers to be still. He listened for the high-pitched whine of the oil company's helicopter, but the sky was quiet. Quickly, he got out and began concealing the car with tree branches and palm fronds that he had cut and stacked for that purpose. One-armed Nick Waters pitched in to help, but the girl Marta apprehensively stood apart, brandishly her cell phone for Twilly to see. "Lily Marshall's number is 2 on my speed dial, and her dad is the sheriff detective, so don't you get any crazy ideas." Twilly smiled. "I'll try to control myself. Are you ready to hike?" "Definitely," the boy said. "How far?" said the girl. 20 minutes later, knee-deep in swamp water, she asked again in a much louder voice. Twilly raised his finger to his lips and continued waiting. He led them along a boggy trail through the treeless marsh until they entered the dry pine flatland. There he saw recent signs of white-tailed deer, bobcats, raccoons, and although he didn't stop to point out the various tracks and scat, Twilly had no time to pay a nature guide. He was in a hurry. Balancing the pizza boxes in a free hand, the boy named Nick came up beside Twilly. In a hushed voice, he said, "Are there panthers out here?" "Didn't you hear one scream when you were on the field trip?" "No, that was you," Nick said, "wasn't it?" Twilly winked and shook his head. "No way," the boy said, thrilled. A few paces behind, the girl named Marta was griping. "Why can't we use the boardwalk like normal people? My brand new Converses are totally trashed." A red-shouldered hawk clutched a mouse in his talons, passed overhead. Once more, Twilly paused and listened. The only sound from above was a woodpecker making holes in the dead tree. When Marta caught up, she said, "This is ridiculous. Where's Mrs. Starch?" Twilly inserted 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled. There's no response, which was agreed-upon signal for himself to proceed. Suddenly, Marta blurted, "Nick, what if he's really not talking to Mrs. Starch? What if he's going to chop us up to pieces and feed us to the alligators?" Human flesh is tough. Gators prefer fish. Twilly nodded and resumed walking. Nick remained at his side. She's just scared is all, he whispered. Twilly understood. He was the first to admit that he wasn't really a reliable-looking person. Soon everything will become clear, he said, more or less. I trust you. Well, Nick Waters, I wouldn't go that far. He got hurt pretty... My father always says to stick with my gut instincts. He got hurt pretty bad in Iraq, right? Nick was taken back. How did you know that? Dwayne mentioned it, Twilly said. You didn't mess up your arm playing lacrosse like you told me, did you? No, that was a lie. I figured. I never saw a backwards swing like that before. Sling like that before. Twilly flicked the odd bump in the boy's shirt behind his right shoulder. He said, there's nothing wrong with my arm. I'm teaching myself to be a lefty. Like your old man's gotta do? Nick nodded and grew quiet. Good for you, Twilly said. He tried to recall if he had ever cared about his own father as deeply as Nick Waters cares about his. The emotions were complicated, as were his of his childhood memories. From behind them, a girl called out, I hope you're both happy. I have blisters on my blisters. They were now close enough that Twilly could smell the woody haze from last night's campfire. When's the last time you saw a wild panther? He said to Nick. Never. Then this is your lucky day. End of chapter 18.